Hi everybody, my name is Hamza Rarou. I'm a PhD student at the Free University of Brussels, and today I will present you my main findings about my ongoing research project about the automotive industry. I will first start off by showing some key figures and some key trends that I've identified with the data that I collected for this research. I will come back to the data collection process later on, but I would like to highlight the following key trends. And the first trend is that we might be witnessing a period where the US hegemony is being challenged by Asian car makers, because up until the 1970s, 1980s, as you can see on the slides here, the US and Europe were dominating the automotive industry, but especially the US. And automotive assembly capacity in Asia Pacific only grew in the 1960s, stagnated around the 70s, and then had an explosive growth throughout the 80s and the 90s to the point that it surpassed the traditional regions that had the largest automotive capacity. And so Asia Pacific nowadays is the largest continent in terms of automotive assembly plants. Two other key features I would like to highlight are based on the top 10 producing countries. And so the first trend that I've observed is that the consolidation of the automotive assembly capacity has decreased over the years. And the second feature is that the composition of top 10 countries has come to include more emerging countries and especially the BRIC countries. So when we look at the consolidation, for example, in 1945, the top 10 countries had over 90% of all automotive assembly plants, and that share has dropped to 65% in 2018. And so we see a gradual decrease over the years. But what we also see is that second feature, namely that the composition of the top 10 countries has changed, and where we see the introduction of emerging countries like Mexico, Brazil, Russia, India, and especially China. So China was virtually absent before 1995, made a first introduction as a top 10 country in 1995, and was also the only country that was able to surpass the United States as the top assembling country, and became the largest country in terms of automotive assembly plants in 2018. What I also did is look at the distribution of assembly plants between countries using two different classifications. And so the first classification is looking at the economic development status of a country and just have a simple binary split between developing and developed. And the first observation is that most plants are actually now located in emerging countries, in developing countries, whereas in 2010 and the years before, most plants were in the developed countries. And the second category that I used is Mordu and Sweeney's classification of countries into a core, semi-periphery, and integrated periphery country. And there again, the bottom line is that most of the assembly plants nowadays are located in the integrated periphery. And there's been a stark and impressive growth and shift of automotive assembly capacity to those kind of countries. Why am I doing this research project? Well, the first reason is that there's been a lot of changes in the last century in the automotive industry under the forces of globalization that have significantly altered the geography. The second reason is that there is a fear in developed countries that they might be deindustrializing and that they're losing assembly capacity to emerging economies. And a third reason of why is that I've actually observed that there is a lack of quantitative explorative spatial analysis of car plants. And lastly, I'm also just passionate about cars, so it's always fun to understand. I will introduce very briefly the theoretical framework. I use a interdisciplinary approach here, and I use concepts from three strands of the literature. The first strand is the footprint analysis research that's been conducted by Clear and Rubenstein in different years, where they detailed the differences in the automotive footprints in North America and Europe. And they gave a very detailed account of how the footprint has changed in a qualitative way. The second strand is evolutionary economic geography theory. I use the theory because it has a dynamic component and it allows to actually understand what the spatial trajectory of an industry would be using concepts of path dependence, cumulative causation, and this theory goes beyond the static way of looking at the spatial structure of an industry in a certain time frame, a sort of like a snapshot. The third strand of literature is international business literature, and I've used here the concept of liability of foreignness more specifically to see if plants that are FDI plants have higher or lower survival rates, and I also use some empirical evidence on the impact of mode of entry on subsidiary performance. The gaps in the literature that I've identified is that there is no previous attempts to actually look at the global assembly footprints. There are also quite some claims in the literature about significant changes in the geographic distribution, but those claims have never been formally tested. And the third gap that I've identified is that the factors that actually have an impact on plant closure and therefore on the spatial trajectory and the evolution of an industry are under researched. Therefore, my first research question is actually fairly simple, and it's to understand how did the assembly footprint change in North America, Europe, and Asia Pacific, and how does the footprint look in 2018? My second research question is, are there any significant spatial shifts in the three major regions? And the third question is, which factors have an impact on the hazard rate of plants, and hazard here being identified and defined as the potential risk of plant closure. And so what are the factors that impact the spatial trajectory of car assembly? The hardest part of this research project has been to collect the data. It's usually very expensive or not widely available, so I constructed my own database of assembly plants that run from 1899 to 2018 of the 15 largest manufacturers in 2016, and that sample also includes 2 Asian manufacturers, so the bias towards Japanese, European, and American car makers is controlled in some way, and so the collective production of these 15 car makers was well over 80% in 2016. All right. The methodologies that I'm applying will be twofold. So the first methodology is a spatial point pattern test. I will use this methodology to detect significant spatial shifts of a footprint. The procedure is detailed in Andresen and Steenbeek 2020. I will not delve too much into detail, but this is the approach that I will be using to see whether spatial point patterns in 2 different time periods are significantly different. The second methodology is a Cox proportional hazard regression model. So I will use this model and follow Boschma and Wenting's example of analyzing the impact of certain factors on the spatial trajectory of the automotive industry. Boschma and Wenting did it in the British context. Klepper has done it in the US context, and Kantner has done it also in the context of Germany. I will be doing it in a global perspective. So the hazard rate here is defined as the risk of a plant closure. And on the right, you see an example of survival curves. And so the survival curves actually show you the survival probability for plants. Here I show it for FDI plants. No is a domestic plant, and yes is an FDI plant. And so it shows you the probability that a plant would survive up until a certain time period. The dependent variable of our model is the age of a plant, which is the difference between the start year of production and the exit year. And the variables that I will study are the following ones. The first is the agglomeration economies variable. I will measure agglomeration economies by using the mean 5 nearest neighbor distances for every plant. The impact on the hazard rate could be either positive or negative. The second variable is an FDI variable. It's a simple dichotomy of plants. Domestic plants are plants that are operated in the home country of a car maker, and FDI plants are plants that are established beyond the national borders of the car maker. The third variable that I use is a variable where I will split plants into different cohorts by their time entry. It is theorized that early entrants have lower hazard rates and thus higher survival rates compared to later entrants. And so I will test for that and see if different cohorts have, especially if the later cohorts have higher hazard rates compared to early entrants. And then the last variable is the entry variable, where I will specifically look at the mode of entry of a plant and how that might impact its hazard rate. Here in the theory, and this comes from the international business theory, I found that joint ventures and merger and acquisition plans are thought of having higher hazard rates compared to wholly owned subsidiaries. And so I will test whether that's also the case for assembly plants in this setting. Now we're gonna look at the main findings. I will first start by looking at the spatial assembly footprints. This is a short video that I have made that shows the difference, the changes in the footprints, and it highlights sort of the main changes that have occurred in the last century. So we'll see that the footprint started in Western Europe, in North America, and up until the 1970s, 80s in North America, we'll see that the footprint is expanding. There is branch assembly production system where plants are basically scattered all over. In Europe, we will see that most of the assembly plants are still located in Western Europe, and there is a agglomeration in the different countries with their national champions. And again, in Asia, it's still pretty dormant in the 60s, 70s, because these were later entrants. In the 1980s, in the US, we see that there is a clearer footprint that would emerge where branch assembly plants are abundant, and there is a corridor that runs to Mexico. We see an eastward expansion in Europe with the fall of communism, and then we see a stark growth in Asia, especially in China, where you have very localized assembly clusters. And so this is basically the main idea and the main message that I would like to convey with the North American footprint has a core around the Detroit area and a corridor that runs all the way to Mexico. Latin American does not really have a clear footprint, but just some localized clusters, especially in Brazil. Europe has also a corridor that runs from the UK all the way to Turkey with a very strong agglomeration, as you can see here, in northeast France and southwest of Germany, and an extension to the east with the new accession rounds that happened in Europe. Africa does not have sort of clear footprint emergent, and Asia Pacific has a footprint that is characterized with localized clusters. Now, looking at significant spatial shifts that have happened, and looking first at the European footprint, I have identified 3 shifts that have been documented in the literature but not tested. And so the first shift is that the fall of the communism in Europe and the European unification with the Treaty of Maastricht in 1992 have led to a shift to Eastern European countries. And I did find evidence for that. So the red colored areas are areas where the number of assembly plants have significantly dropped, and blue are areas, or countries in this case, where the number of assembly plants has significantly increased. And so we see that old peripheries and even core countries like Italy have lost the number of assembly plants in a significant way, whereas Central Eastern Europe and Turkey has gained some new assembly plants. So we do see here some evidence of an eastward shift. The second shift that I tested for is the impact of, or the correlation rather, of the EU enlargements in 2004-2007. And there again, I find evidence that there is a eastward shift to Russia and Romania, Hungary, Czech Republic, and Slovakia, and that this came at an expense of the old traditional countries, core countries, France, Italy, Belgium, UK. The third shift I tested for was a financial crisis, and there again we see a shift to the east. In North America, the shift that I tested for was the post-Fordism effect and the arrival of Japanese car makers. There we see that Canada has gained in terms of footprint expansion, and that the US has lost. And the second shift is the impact of the financial crisis. And here again, I see that the footprint significantly shifted to the south, to Mexico, who gained from this financial crisis. In the Asian context, the only shift I analyzed is the shift up to the north, away from Australia and New Zealand, who have lost their automotive assembly capacity, whereas Southeast Asia and East Asia actually have gained in terms of assembly capacity. And I will now move to the last part of my analysis, which is the analysis of the assembly plant survival. The incidence rates of plant closure is 28%, which is actually not negligible. And I will start by looking at the different survival curves by the 4 variables that I've identified earlier. So first, I will look at the survival curves based on the nearest neighbor distances of plants, which is my proxy for agglomeration economies. And the takeaway of this first graph is that the survival curves are significantly different from each other. And it does seem that plants who agglomerate at the medium distance range, between 50 and 250 kilometers, have higher survival probabilities than firms that are agglomerated at very short distances or very large distances. One of the possible explanations of why that might be the case is, as documented in Clear and Rubenstein's 2010 studies about the North American footprint, is that for car makers, for example, in North America, they use this 2-hour drive rule of thumb in their site selection process. And that coincides with roughly 160 kilometers. And when I looked at my own data, I also found that the Japanese plants in North America had a nearest neighbor distance of 163 kilometers, and European plants in North America had a 162 kilometer nearest neighbor distance. And so it does seem that they use that rule of thumb. And one of the reasons why assembly plants did that is because they wanted to be far enough from other assembly plants so they wouldn't have to compete for the same qualified labor force and workers. And so that would explain potentially why the survival rates of those of that medium range distance confers a higher survival rates than the others. And the same story actually for plants that are in very high and dense agglomerations at less than 50 kilometers. There, the competitive pressure is higher because they're competing for the same suppliers and they're competing for the same qualified labor force, and that might negatively impact their survival rates. Moving on to the second graph, we look at the survival rates based on the different cohorts, the different time of entry. The survival curves are significantly different from each other, and there's one cohort that seems to have the highest survival rate at any age, and it seems to be the cohort of 1950 and 1980. And one possible explanation is that that period actually in the automotive industry was one characterized by trade liberalization. The Bretton Woods agreements were signed at that point. Europe was rebuilding. The automotive industry in Asia Pacific was actually emerging, growing. One of the first international expansions were happening. And so it was a relatively stable period compared to the other periods. And so that might be one of the possible explanations as to why that happens. Moving on to the third graph, here looking at survival rates between domestic plants and foreign and plants established through foreign direct investments, and it seems that domestic plants have higher survival rates than plants that are assembling abroad, and that gives some power to that liability of foreigners argument. That says that, well, plants that are producing abroad, they have to deal with more risks, more uncertainties, and they are at a cost disadvantage compared to domestic firms. And then the fourth graph, the main takeaway there is that joint ventures seems to have the lowest survival rates, and merger and acquisitions seems to have the highest survival rates. Why that might be the case is something I have to investigate more fully. Then I will present preliminary results of the Cox regression models that I've run. I've run 4 separate models with every variable in order to study the impact of that variable on the survival rates. And then at the end, I will present the 2 full models. So the first model looks at the impact of agglomeration economies. And here it seems that plants at the medium range between 50 and 250 kilometers have a significant survival rates that is lower compared to the plants that agglomerate at very short distances. So actually for this model and for all the other models, we always have to select a certain reference category. For agglomeration economies, it's the 50 kilometer range that is the reference, and so we compare the hazard rates to that group. The second model that I've run looks at the effect of FDI, and there it's a significant effect at the 10% level, and FDI plants have 30% more chance of plant closures. And both of these models have a significant likelihood ratio test. The third model looks at the effect of time of entry, whether later entrants have lower survival risks and thus higher hazard rates. I do not find evidence for that. The only group that seems to have a significant hazard rate is the 1980 to the 2000s cohorts, and they seem to have a higher hazard rates compared to the 1950 cohorts. And then the fourth model looks at the effect of mode of entry. And here, the takeaway is that joint ventures and wholly owned subsidiaries have significantly higher hazard rates than domestic plants. And joint ventures seem to be the more risky ventures and the more risky plants in terms of survival risks. Then the first full model, there I plug in the FDI variable, cohort variable, the time of entry effect, and the agglomeration economies. Agglomeration economies, again, are consistent with previous findings. It's the medium range that has a significant effect. For the cohort, against evidence for that third cohort compared to the 1950 cohort. And FDI does not seem to be significant anymore when controlling for the 2 other variables. So it does seem that FDI plants have higher hazard rates and lower survival than domestic plants, but it turns out to not be significant anymore. And this model, again, is also significant, looking at the ratio tests of a maximum likelihood. And then the last model, there I plug in cohort agglomeration economies, but include the entry, and the mode of entry has an impact on agglomeration economies. And the main previous findings actually hold. Agglomeration economies at medium range are significant. Cohorts turn out to not be significant anymore, so the time of entry does not seem to explain whether the hazard rate increases or decreases, but the mode of entry seems to play an important role. Joint ventures and wholly owned subsidiaries have higher closure risks than domestic plants, and again, joint ventures seem to be the more risky mode of entry globally. All right, so we've come to the end of this presentation. A few takeaways about everything that's been said. So the first takeaway is that the automotive footprint in 2018 is mostly located in emerging economies and countries that are labeled as integrated peripheral countries. The automotive footprint in North America and Europe is characterized by this auto alley or a corridor, whereas the footprint in Asia Pacific is characterized by very local clusters in India, Thailand, Indonesia, and in China. When looking at events that might have shaped the footprint, it seems that the financial crisis, regional integration, and trade liberalization have significantly shifted the location of that footprint. When we look at the factors that have an impact on the spatial trajectory of an industry, agglomeration economies have a significant effect and seem to play an important role in the survival rates. And plants that are agglomerated between 50 and 250 kilometers have higher chances of survival than firms outside of that range. The time of entry, the results there are not that forthcoming or that robust, depending on the model specifications. So time of entry does not seem to play an important role, but the mode of entry does. And it seems that plants that are wholly owned or that were established through a joint venture have more risks of an exit compared to domestic plants, and joint venture plants seem to be the more riskier option. This is it. I would like all to thank you for having watched my presentation.